On February 22, 1797, George Washington's 65th birthday, the most famous cook in America walked off Mount Vernon and disappeared. He picked the date on purpose. All across the country that day, and especially in Philadelphia, where Washington was celebrating his last birthday as president at a grand ball, the nation's attention was fixed on the great man. Nobody was watching a plantation in Virginia. Nobody was counting the enslaved staff. And so, while the President of the United States was toasted at a ball in the Capitol, the man who had cooked for that president for years, who had run his kitchen, designed his menus, fed his guests and his cabinet and his foreign dignitaries, quietly walked away from the plantation and vanished into the country as a free man. His name was Hercules. He had been, by any reasonable measure, a celebrity, one of the most admired cooks in the United States, known on the streets of Philadelphia, a man who dressed in velvet and carried a gold-topped cane. And George Washington, who owned him, spent the rest of his life trying to get him back and never found him. He was never caught. Some months after he vanished, a French prince visiting Mount Vernon spoke to Hercules' little daughter, a girl of 6, and said to her gently that she must be very sad, knowing she would never see her father again. And the child gave an answer that has outlived the prince and the plantation and nearly everyone who was alive that day. This is his story. Welcome to Behind the Throne. Start in the kitchen, because the kitchen is where he became somebody. Hercules was born around 1748. Before George Washington ever owned him, he was enslaved by a neighbor, a man named John Posey, whose plantation adjoined Mount Vernon, and from whom Hercules would eventually take the surname he used as a free man. John Posey owed George Washington money and could not pay, and in the settling of that debt, Hercules became Washington's property. He came to Mount Vernon as a man transferred to cover a bill, and at Mount Vernon he found his way into the kitchen, and in the kitchen he turned out to be extraordinary. By the 1780s and into the 1790s, Hercules was the head cook of the mansion house at Mount Vernon, and then, when Washington became president, the head cook of the president's house itself. Understand what that job actually was. Washington was the most important man in the country, and the meals served in his household were instruments of state. Dinners for senators, for cabinet officers, for foreign ministers, spreads designed to project the dignity and permanence of a brand new nation that most of the world expected to fail. The man who produced those meals, who ran that kitchen, who commanded its staff and its budget and its standards, was Hercules. He ran it, by every account, like a commander. The kitchen under him was famously disciplined, spotless, exacting. Washington's step-grandson later remembered him as a man of real authority, whose kitchen was run with the seriousness of a military operation. And Hercules became in Philadelphia a genuine public figure. The city was then the capital of the United States, and Hercules was a known man in it. He had a particular privilege that came with his position, the customary right of a chef to sell the leftovers and byproducts of a great kitchen, the slush, the surplus. From that trade, Hercules earned real money of his own, and it is estimated he brought in a substantial sum each year, enough to make him, in his own way, prosperous. And he spent it on how he looked. Hercules was a dandy. This is documented, and it is one of the details that makes him leap off the page. When his work was done and he walked out into the Philadelphia evening, he dressed magnificently. Velvet collars, polished shoes, a fine coat, a large watch chain with a fob hanging from it, and a gold-topped cane in his hand. He was a spectacle, a black man of obvious style and standing moving through the streets of the capital, tipping his hat, known to the city. He had made himself, inside the narrow and humiliating space the world allowed him, into someone, a person of reputation, a person people recognized. He was also the entire time property, and Washington never once let him forget which of those two things the law considered real. Here is the mechanism, and it tells you everything about the distance between the man Washington was in the story America tells and the man he was to Hercules. Pennsylvania, where the capital sat, had passed a gradual abolition law. Under it, an enslaved person brought into the state and kept there continuously for 6 months became legally free. 6 months of residence, and the chains dissolved by operation of Pennsylvania law. Washington knew this, and Washington, the President of the United States, personally arranged to defeat it. He had his enslaved household staff rotated, sent back to Virginia across the state line before the 6-month clock could run out, and then brought back to Philadelphia to start the clock over. It was deliberate. The correspondence shows it being managed carefully, quietly, so as not to look like exactly what it was. The president of the new republic was running his own household staff back and forth across a state line on a schedule, specifically to prevent them from becoming free under the law of the state where he governed. Hercules was subject to those rotations. The most celebrated cook in America, the dandy with the gold-topped cane, was shuttled in and out of Philadelphia like a piece of furniture moved to dodge attacks, because his owner had done the arithmetic and decided that Hercules' freedom was a loss to be prevented. And Hercules understood the arithmetic perfectly. He had money, reputation, mobility, and skill, and none of it changed the fact that he could be sent anywhere, sold to anyone at any time, by a man who was at that very moment being toasted across the world as the father of liberty. There was one moment where he was asked about it directly, and his answer is worth holding on to. Late in the Philadelphia years, there was some suspicion around Hercules, a sense that a man with his resources and his freedom of movement might be thinking about running. He was confronted about it. And Hercules, according to the account, reacted with wounded dignity, insisting on his loyalty, appearing genuinely hurt that anyone would think he'd flee the household he served so faithfully. It was a performance. It was exactly the performance a brilliant man in his position would give, because the alternative, letting them see that he was measuring the distance to freedom, was the one thing guaranteed to get the distance closed. Hercules had spent his whole life reading powerful white people and giving them the face they needed to see. He gave them this one too, and then he waited. What finally moved him from thinking about it to doing it was almost certainly what happened to his son. Hercules had children at Mount Vernon, 3 of them born into slavery on the estate, a son, Richmond, and 2 daughters. In November of 1796, Richmond was caught stealing money, and Washington, turning it over, came to a specific suspicion that the money was being gathered to fund an escape, and that the escape was Hercules's. The consequence fell on both of them, and it fell hard, and it is the cruelest hinge in the story. Hercules, the celebrated chef, the man who had run the president's kitchen for years, was taken out of the kitchen. When the Washingtons returned to Philadelphia after Christmas of 1796, Hercules and Richmond were left behind at Mount Vernon, and they were not left in the kitchen. The farm records show them put to hard manual labor, pulverizing stone, digging clay for bricks, grubbing honeysuckle out of the ground by the roots. The most famous cook in America, the dandy of Philadelphia, was sent out to break rock and dig clay in the Virginia winter. It was a demotion designed to humiliate, and it was a warning, and it removed the last reason Hercules had to stay. The position that had given his life its meaning and its small measure of dignity had been taken from him. He was digging clay now. There was nothing left to protect. So he waited for the date, and the date was Washington's birthday. On February 22, 1797, while Washington was in Philadelphia being celebrated at his final birthday ball as president, the farm reports at Mount Vernon list Hercules as absconded. He was gone. He had timed it to the one day when the entire country's eyes were on his owner and nobody would be looking at a plantation kitchen that no longer even had him in it. He walked off Mount Vernon and did not stop, and he was, from that morning, a free man in every way except the legal one. Washington's reaction is a matter of record, and it is not the reaction of a man untroubled by the loss. He wanted Hercules back. He was, in the words of one contemporary, stunned. He made inquiries. He leaned on people. Through the following year, he pressed his former household steward in Philadelphia, a man named Frederick Kit, for any word of where the cook had gone, and Kit wrote back that he had been making distant inquiries, that he had finally heard Hercules was somewhere in the city, but that finding him would be very difficult given, as Kit put it, the secret manner necessary to be observed on the occasion. Everyone understood that Hercules was being hidden, that the free black community of Philadelphia had closed around him, and that no one who knew where he was would say. Washington even wrote, around this time, that he was thinking of buying another cook, while noting, in a line that would be funny if it were not so much the whole tragedy, that he had resolved never again to become the owner of another slave by purchase. He wanted the meals back. He simply did not want to reckon with what wanting them meant. He never found Hercules. The most powerful man in America, with agents and correspondents in the full weight of his name, could not locate one cook who had decided to disappear. Hercules had planned it as carefully as he had ever planned a state dinner, and it held. And now the daughter. In April of 1797, a few weeks after Hercules vanished, a French prince came to Mount Vernon. This was Louis Philippe, who would one day be King of France, traveling in America during his years of exile. And he kept a diary, and in that diary he recorded a small scene that is one of the most quietly devastating things in the whole record of American slavery. The prince's party encountered Hercules' daughter at Mount Vernon. She was 6 years old, and one of the Frenchmen making conversation said to the little girl what any adult would say, that she must be so unhappy, knowing she would never see her father again. The child answered him, and what she said, as Louis Philippe wrote it down in his own diary, was this: "Oh, sir, I am very glad because he is free now." She was 6. Her father was gone, and she would never see him again, and she knew it. And what she felt, the thing strong enough to override a 6-year-old's grief at losing her father, was gladness because he was free. That is what freedom was worth, on the ground, to the people who did not have it. It was worth never seeing your father again and being glad of it. A child of 6 understood the exchange perfectly and did the math out loud to a visiting prince, and the prince was struck enough by it to write it in his diary, where it sat for 2 centuries until historians went looking and found it. Here is the part that keeps the daughter's answer from being anything like a happy ending, because Hercules got free, but his children did not. Hercules had married a woman named Alice, who was a dower slave, meaning she belonged not to Washington outright, but to the estate of Martha Washington's first husband, held for the Custis heirs. And under the law, the children of a dower slave inherited dower status, which meant that when George Washington died in 1799 and his will freed the people he personally owned, Hercules, legally emancipated on paper on the first day of 1801 under the terms of that will, became officially free at last. But his children, because their mother had been a dower slave, were not covered by Washington's will. They could not be freed by it. They remained enslaved, the property of the Custis estate, after their father was legally free and long gone. So the little girl who was glad her father was free stayed a slave. Hercules had escaped alone because escaping was a thing you did with one body in the dark, and he could not carry 3 children through it, and the law that finally freed him did not reach them. He bought his own freedom with the only currency available, his presence, his fatherhood, the sight of his own children, and the bill was exactly what his daughter named the prince. He would be free, and he would never see them again, and those were the same sentence. Hercules lived out his freedom in New York City under the name Hercules Posey. He was by then an old man, and the sources thin out the way they always do when a person stops being of interest to the powerful. He was free. He was in New York. He worked, presumably, at the thing he was better at than almost anyone alive, and he died there on May 15th, 1812, a free man, having never been caught, having never gone back, having never, as far as the record shows, seen his children again. For most of 2 centuries, even the basic facts of his escape were wrong. The story that got written down and repeated for 80 years, set in print in 1933 by a descendant of Washington's own secretary, was a comfortable little lie. That Hercules had run away from Philadelphia because he was so captivated with the delights of the city that he couldn't bear to return to Virginia. In that telling, he wasn't fleeing bondage. He was a man too fond of the nightlife, a charming rogue who loved the big city. It made his escape into a lark. It removed the clay digging and the demotion and the son suspected of raising escape money and the 6-month rotations designed to cheat him of his freedom, and left a happy fat cook who liked Philadelphia too much. It was a research specialist at Mount Vernon named Mary Thompson who finally went into the actual farm records in 2009 and found the truth, that Hercules escaped not from Philadelphia but from Mount Vernon, not as a man indulging himself but as a man who had been stripped of his kitchen and put to breaking rock, and that he did it on the 22nd of February, the president's birthday, with the whole country looking the other way. He had cooked the most important meals in America, he had dressed like a prince and been recognized in the streets of the capital, and the freest, truest thing he ever made was the plan to disappear on the one day no one would be counting, which he executed perfectly and from which he never once looked back. His daughter told a real prince why. She was 6 and she had it exactly right. He was free now. That was the whole of it, and it was worth everything it cost, including her.